Hello, everyone. Good day to you all, and I hope that you all are having an amazing day with your loved ones. And if you happen to be popping onto this YouTube channel for the first time, my name is Sage, and I am here on YouTube, really just sharing things that I'm unpacking on my own personal journey of my own spirituality. Previously, as a Neopagan priestess, a part of the New Age, a witch, and just looking at different things from a perspective now that I've chosen to step away from it. And the perspectives that I'm sharing, including the one today, is not to judge anybody to say, hey, I'm right and you're wrong. I'm just sharing the things that I've uncovered for myself through history. And today, this video is going to be on the history of tarot. And for those that maybe are just like how I was, maybe you were or are currently a witch, a part of the New Age, maybe you are a practicing Neopagan and you've taken this on as a tool. My question for you would be, how much do you know of the history of tarot? Because I think that's something that is important. And for me, I will be completely honest in that, yes, I knew of the different figures that had essentially began the journey of the tarot, but I did not know certain nuances that colored the different perceptions that even carry us into today in the 21st century. And so I wanted to just share with you today really just the history of it. The tarot starts in the 15th century during the Renaissance, and tarot was actually known to be a parlor game, a card game, really played by people essentially just as a leisure activity. And the tarot cards that were made around this time, they were more hand-drawn. They weren't mass-produced like you see today. It took a lot of effort to make a deck of tarot cards, but it was still essentially a parlor game around the 15th and even the 16th century. And we do see some interesting decks around this time because the deck was the same as a modern day tarot deck today of 78 cards, 56 of them being standard suits, and then the 22 being the main cards that we see today in tarot as the major arcana. But back then, there were two decks, at least that we know of, that had existed, and one is a Sola Busca deck from 1490, and then there's also the Marseille deck. And the earliest surviving cards that we have of the Marseille deck is from Jean Noblet in Paris from 1650. And so yes, this travels between 15th, 16th, 17th century. People started to look at these cards as a form of finding patterns, finding, seeing probability in them. Because when you're playing a game of cards, especially if you think of poker, for example, you're going to try to look for patterns. You are going to try to look for different probabilities to be able to create the best outcome for the game. And so objectively, that is what our human mind does on a psychological level, is we try to create patterns and sense out of what we do not understand. And when you're playing a game of cards, objectively, that is what you do. And because people were doing that around this time, during the 18th century, we now have a lot of French occultists at that time, or let's just say tarot researchers, that started to look at the tarot for meaning, to look at it beyond it being a parlor card game. And there are two figures during this time that existed that really essentially colored the meaning of tarot being more than just a card game, but more of a tool of divination. And those two figures are Jean-Baptiste Alliette, or also known as Etiella, and then Antoine Court de Gébaline. I will be saying some French words today that I may know how to say, or I might just say, hey, it says this here in the writing. I'm not going to try to butcher it, so please forgive me in that. But first figure that we see is Jean-Baptiste Alliette, also known as Etiella. And for tarot readers, they know of Etiella as essentially being the first person in our human history to have made a living by card divination and interpreting symbology. Because Etiella, he was a French occultist and tarot researcher that essentially was the first to develop interpretations of the cards beyond, probabilities and patterns. He started to look at it it from more of an esoteric sense of applying meanings of astrology, of the elements, of the four humors. And he had written two different texts during the 18th century, one of them being this one, that is a very long one in French that I will not say, which said that the tarot was a way to recreate yourself with a deck of cards. And then in 1790, through this text here, that I will not say in French and butcher, is also him just building on the foundations of what became later on the major and minor arcana, and then the intros of the four elements in astrology as meanings in the cards. During that time as well, we have Antoine Comte de Gibelin, who was also a French occultist, and he was also a former Protestant minister, and so his occult studies came on later in life, to where he was first to actually propose that the cards were stemmed from ancient Egypt and the wisdom of Thoth. And so anybody that knows about tarot in a modern day has probably been told that. These things were written by him in a text called On the Tarot from 1787, along with Le Monde Primitif. And in On the Tarot, he was the first to propose that. Also said that, hey, this tarot is an arcane repository of timeless esoteric wisdom. Now, he also was the first to connect the tarot with the 22 major arcana to the Hebrew alphabet. However, modern historians have found that the claims from Antoine Comte de Gibelin specifically, that the claims that tarot comes from ancient Egypt is false. Because whenever Antoine Comte de Gibelin made these claims, he never did so with any benefit of someone actually deciphering the Egyptian language. And so there was no historical evidence that the tarot had ever came from ancient Egypt. And so it is a narrative that has run through the course of our history as being true when there has actually been no historical evidence as it has been looked at today, even by modern historians. So that is interesting. And then of course the link with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet to the 22 major arcana has not been a theory today, even still, that has had a great measure of proof in that. That is just from according to history. But all to say that this particular mystical association with the tarot set the stage for what we see in the history of tarot going through the 19th century and onwards until today. And so in the 19th century, we have a major figure who is called Eliphas Levi. And Eliphas Levi, for those that are really well-versed in esoteric and occult studies, know his name, because he essentially has been nicknamed the grandfather of all occult studies in our Western world. And he absolutely has lived up to that name, because he has written well over 20 books on magic, Kabbalah, alchemical studies, and occultism, that he is essentially a household name for esoteric and occult practitioners. And so Eliphas Levi was born Alphonse Louis Constant, and actually in his life wanted to be a Catholic priest, but didn't go to become fully ordained because of some questionable beliefs and behavior. I won't go into that because this is about tarot, but he remained a cleric his whole life. And he wrote the Bible of Liberty in 1841 and then the Dictionaries of Christian Literature. But these are the last of his two orthodox works before finding a refuge in the occult and in esotericism. And he was the first to create the idea that the tarot was a mystical key. He was also continuing the narrative of the Hebrew alphabet being connected with the tarot, the Kabbalah tree of life, philosophy, universal knowledge, a lot of added on concepts through that time. But essentially under Eliphas Levi, the tarot was a means to decipher the true essence of a true single universal religion of Catholicism. So that was actually his goal originally. He talks a lot about the concepts of magic because essentially he was a ceremonial magician. He is hailed as one of the most influential ceremonial magicians of that time. And in one book that he had written called The Mysteries of Magic, he very much said, you know, hey, if somebody is going to engage in magic, in divination, in any of these forms, that there are so many different things that a ceremonial magician has to be able to do to be in that place where they can engage with, in his eyes, God. But there was an interesting part in his text on the mysteries of magic, published in 1886. Let those who seek in magic to satisfy their passions pause in that deadly path, where they will find nothing but death or madness. This is the significance of the vulgar tradition that the devil finished sooner or later by strangling the sorcerers. And then from the 19th century, we enter the 20th century, where we start to see a lot more familiar names and groups that I think a lot of modern day tarot readers would recognize. And in the 20th century, we start with a group called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And they were established in 1888 in London, and they were an organization that studied esotericism, both admitted men and women. So they were very much an organization that was ahead of their time in the 20th century. All of these people, great thinkers that wanted to get together to talk about different world views, different spiritual views. And so during that time, in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, we have two figures that have come out of that group. One of them being Arthur Edward Waite, and then the second one being Aleister Crowley. And Arthur Edward Waite, A.E. Waite, if you don't know that name, that is a household name in the tarot world. He, alongside artist Pamela Colman Smith, had created the Rider-Waite deck in 1904. And this particular deck, this is a famous deck that everybody knows of who has ever study the tarot. This is advised to be the very first deck that somebody touches in order to truly understand the origins, the history, the symbology of tarot. And so Arthur Edward Waite and Pamela Colman Smith, both members of the Order of the Golden Dawn, had created this deck in 1904, and it was very heavy on symbolism of, yes, both Kabbalistic symbolism, but also inspired by the Sola Busca deck that we had talked about during the 15th century. And as far as the imagery and how it is that they presented it. And with Arthur Edward Waite, he had wrote about the tarot in his book called The Pictorial Key to the Tarot from 1911, that the tarot for him was not associated with mystical ancient texts. And so he was possibly the first to say, hey, this isn't what we thought it was from Homeboy de Gibelin back in the day. But he did say that the tarot was seen as more of a mystical allegory, and being able to interpret the symbols of the cards through archetypes. In his particular text, you don't see anything about channeling or protection or anything like that in the tarot. And he actually was one of Aleister Crowley's main advisors during that time in the Order of the Golden Dawn. And so, interestingly enough, you think of, okay, these two men have come from the Order of the Golden Dawn and essentially both created tarot decks. Now, why is that? So, the Order of the Golden Dawn and even the Golden Dawn deck, that is also a known deck that has been created by them, is the Order of the Golden Dawn in their particular text called An Introduction to the Golden Dawn Tarot. They say that the tarot must be viewed as a pedagogical tool intended to lead to a deep-rooted understanding, and that the tarot was a tool, or essentially flashcards, to teach their members about the principles of their esoteric practices and beliefs. And so again, no mention of really communicating with spirits and the divine, as you want to call it, for somebody. And that is from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn that both Arthur E. Waite and Aleister Crowley stemmed from. Now, that was Arthur Edward Waite's perspective essentially on the tarot that I had found. Then there's Aleister Crowley. And so Aleister Crowley joined the Order of the Golden Dawn later on in life, and Arthur Edward Waite was one of his main advisors that he would go to. But we find in historical texts that later on in life, Crowley really attacked Waite in many writings in his later years. They were essentially a nemesis to one another, and they didn't get along. And a lot of the factions that began to be created within the Order of the Golden Dawn, there were just different disagreements on how it is that they related to the occult and esotericism, and the different tools that they created, the different principles they studied. I will share that Aleister Crowley had very, very different ideas of the tarot, of magic, than his said predecessors like Arthur E. Waite, and then also even Eliphas Levi. Because Aleister Crowley, we know him as the creator of the Thoth Tarot. In his book called Tarot Symbolism and Divination from 1947, he had shared that the tarot for him was a way to have communion with the divine. And for him, he saw tarot, divination, and all that, that is a communion with the divine, and also has magic and tarot and divination as a part of an alchemical process of personal power to essentially become a godhead. And if anybody knows Aleister Crowley's name, yes, he has been known in history and very proudly claimed the nickname of the Beast, and was associated with the number 666. He was an extremely controversial figure, even within the Order of the Golden Dawn. And his background, his personal background that may have colored his views, I'm not going to really talk about that today because the topic is on the history of tarot. However, I can see how his personal background may have colored his more radical beliefs than from his fellow members of the Order of the Golden Dawn. And so whenever he created the Book of Thoth Tarot, he did so alongside artist Lady Frida Harris, and so also members of Order of the Golden Dawn, but their factions split to where even Arthur Edward Waite left the Golden Dawn in 1893, and he came in and out, but then essentially decided to become a Freemason in 1901, and then Aleister Crowley did end up leaving as well, but went on to create his own particular groups. For example, there's the Thelema, the Order Temporis Orientis. He was a very interesting figure. So he had these very, very starkly different beliefs on the tarot, which was, for, in his eyes, to become God, not to gain glimpses of God, but to become God. And because of that, during that time, he was considered an incredibly controversial figure and blasphemous to many people, even being criticized within his own occult and esoteric circles. And so that is interesting. That is interesting. But then we have tarot that moves into a place of now, we see tarot experiencing a revival in the 1970s of what we call the New Age movement, where the New Age meaning that it is a time in our Western society where different ideas of spirituality from, let's say, Hinduism, Buddhism, and different even esoteric beliefs start to make their way into our cultures, where people are essentially expanding their minds, right? Whether it's through the use of studying something different than what they've been taught, or experimenting with drugs, or they want to expand their mind. This is the time of the New Age. So various things were being done. But tarot made its way into the 1970s as well, to where we see is a mass production of decks. And that was all because of one person called Stuart R. Kaplan. And Stuart R. Kaplan was not an occultist. He was not a researcher necessarily, but he was a businessman who had a fascination with games. And he saw the tarot as like a fun game, card game, just like any other game person would, right? But for him, he had actually imported a tarot deck to the US called the Swiss 1JJ. I wasn't able to find much on that. However, he did write a text on the tarot cards for fun and fortune telling in 1970, but essentially he is the man who owned the rights to now what we know as a mass-produced deck of the Rider-Waite deck. And he actually ended up owning the rights to the Waite deck by asking for the blessing of Waite's one and only daughter, Sybil. And so how that went, I don't know, but he all of a sudden owned the rights to it, and hence the most reprinted tarot deck of our history. And around that time, the tarot deck was not seen as much of how you see it in our previous history, in more of the esoteric and occult studies and creating their own decks for essentially tools and flashcards for studying their principles. Tarot decks were seen as a tool of self-help and a healing resource. And it's an interesting shift that took, because that was a lot of the mentality around the 1970s of different things like practicing yoga, taking psychedelics, and, you know, studying the tarot or using tarot cards, or, you know, communicating, channeling. Like, these were all seen as essentially healing resources and tools for self-help or self-enlightenment. That is something that is very characteristic of the New Age, and the tarot was not spared of that particular perception. And so bringing that to the 21st century to today, where there are so many varieties of tarot decks, of oracle decks. You can see them in different forms. There's ones for kids. There is, you know, ones that have fairy tale characters in them that you can see. And so it has been a very creatively woven tool in our human history. And it is one that a lot of people are introduced to very innocently, whether it's through TikTok, whether it is through YouTube, whether it is, hey, you know, my friend just got this deck and it's so pretty, it's so cute, the imagery draws us in. A lot of us have been introduced to tarot very innocently, and we don't really ever think objectively about what the tarot is and what it is used for. There was also another interesting book that did the same thing in looking at history, and there is a book published in 1996 by historians Decker, de Paulis, and Dumont, called A Wicked Pack of Cards. And in them, looking at the different aspects of history on the tarot as well, but obviously much more in depth than I can do, they did a lot of research. They saw the tarot as being a subject of the most successful propaganda campaign ever launched, that included an entire false history and a false interpretation. And so that is just interesting. Yes, objectively, a tarot deck, objectively, is a deck of cards of just paper, pieces of paper, and how they are used can look differently to a person. All at the same time, you know, it can be used objectively as, let's say, a form of talk therapy, where somebody is just using the cards to be able to have a conversation with their subconscious, right? I don't think anybody necessarily sees that as a problem. It's like, okay, it's no different than, let's say, going to a therapy session, but now you're having cards in front of you, and now you're just having a talk with your subconscious self, versus, let's say, tarot being a form of divination. Divination meaning a practice of seeking knowledge of the future and the unknown by supernatural means. That's where then tarot becomes a form of divination, to where I think that's where a lot of the tension can be had, is within that space of tarot is a form of divination, meaning that tarot then is being used as a form of communicating with things outside of our own subconscious and the things that we believe around that. I would just encourage for people to just critically think through that and evaluate, okay, do I have a well-researched conclusion to why I use this particular tool, or have I maybe used it blindly? And hey, if that's the case for you, hey, I had some blindness as well in that. However, I have come to my own conclusions for my own path in life that I personally didn't want to use a tool or some form of a resource that was essentially not built on truths. But if you did enjoy this video and if you stuck around thus far, thank you. Thank you. And please feel free to share this video, to share it with somebody who maybe is in a spot of maybe wanting to know more of the historical aspect and not just what people had told them. And also, if there's somebody that maybe has been questioning those different practices for themselves, please feel free to share. And if you do enjoy this particular content here on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe on the button below. And yes, I will see you guys in the next video, and thanks so much for watching.